Hello, Professor Ray and GTA Sacchini. I will be going over the attack slash exploit explanation of this attack, cross-scripting attack that I found. Um, I found it very difficult to demonstrate a live demo because it would require me to create a vulnerable social media networking site. Uh, that was susceptible to cross-scripting attacks, and that was very difficult to do, more than what this assignment entails. So I think it would be best to describe what the worm did to this social media networking website that I'll be describing. Um, I'll just go line by line, and so you can get a general grasp of what was going on and how Samy the hacker was able to accomplish his goal. Okay, so some brief background on this attack. Um, Back in the day, MySpace was the first major social media networking platform in the entire world. So it was obviously susceptible to uh, attacks. It definitely had a lot of vulnerabilities that weren't taken seriously because nobody or not there hadn't been many hack attacks uh, in the world of the internet because it was just such a new platform, and so obviously there's going to be lots of vulnerabilities. And MySpace in 2005 had cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, and Samy, a 19-year-old young man from the USA, took advantage of these vulnerabilities. But his intentions were never to create any harm, and they weren't evil. It was just to amass a level of social proof, social status, popularity, and that was his entire focus, was to gain popularity on MySpace. And he did this by writing a cross-site scripting worm that would propagate throughout from user to user. And what the intentions behind the worm is that it would make any user that visited Samy's profile to automatically add him as a friend and send him a friend request. And then Samy could go back in and just accept the friend request of the user that viewed his profile. But that was not the only thing that Samy wanted to do. He also wanted to have that same user add Samy as one of their heroes in their hero list that MySpace used to have, or maybe still does. And so back in the day, the user of MySpace would just list some heroes on their profile, and that was it. So Samy wanted to, at the end of that hero list, put, but my, I'll search it up, but my, but most of all, Samy is my hero. So that's what Samy wanted to append this line to the list of heroes that the user had. And he successfully did do that. And I'll show you how. So as you can see, or as you hear, uh, it was a harmless worm. But it did propagate extremely quickly. And within 20 hours, he received over a million friend requests and since there were so many requests, the entire MySpace web server collapsed, and they were down for about 2 to 3 hours. And 6 months later, he was sentenced. He was sentenced, and he was found guilty, and he had to serve 3 years of probation. Uh, and he was not allowed any access to a computer, and so he did suffer some consequences for doing this. Um, so let's begin with the code. All right, so here's the worm that he provided to us. Here's the code that he wrote up for us to examine. As you can see, there are no. It's all very dense and collapsed, and this was because there was a character limit wherever he inputted this, and so it had to be very nice and concise and contain no uh, spaces or new lines, and it had to have simple variable names like L, E, very non-descriptive variable names, and but this was all intentional. And so what I did to make it easier for us to read and go over is I copy and pasted this code into my IntelliJ. I called it sammywarm.js, and then kind of just split it up so we can split it up like this so we can read it properly. And yes, and I also reorganized it a bit so it could flow in a nice manner while I'm describing what's going on. Alright, so let's begin. So Samy did use JavaScript to write a script. I think most cross-scripting attacks are written in JavaScript. It's probably the easiest way to implement that sort of attack. And right off the bat, JavaScript is a term that was banned by MySpace. So what he had to do is he had to get clever and split up JavaScript with a new line character. So as you can see, this is split up on purpose because there needs to be a new line character here so that MySpace doesn't. So this can pass the sanity check that MySpace had. And if we go back to the original code, you can see that that new line does exist too. See, because also some web browsers read this as JavaScript, even though there is a new line character in the middle of it. All right, and then also he had to put all the entire script in this express attribute. And then he also had to give an ID to this div so he could call it by name. So that's what he did. He just called document.all.mycode and then .express to get the script, the entire script. All right, moving on. Okay, so let's begin. All right, so the first couple lines of code are ASCII characters, and ASCII number 34 is equal to double quote to a single double quote, which is one of these, and then 39 is equal to a single quote, one of those, and that's what B and A are equal to. The reason why he wrote it in this manner is because double quotes and single quotes are considered, I think, escape characters, and MySpace did a good job of not allowing these characters to do what Samy wanted them to do. So instead, he just called them by ASCII values, and he was able to do what he wanted with them. Alright, so as you can see, this is all global. These are global variables, and this is a global if and else statement. So this is the first thing to execute out of anything out there. Actually, no, this is right here. So we can look at that, get query parameters real quick, since it's going to be the first thing to execute in this entire script. Alright, so what this function does, I wrote a quick little description here. Cool. So this function does exactly what the title says. It gets the query parameters from the URL. It uses document.search location, which just returns a query string part of a URL. And if we assume that the current URL is this right here, then the variable x if we assume that the location.search, or the location is this line right here, this URL. So yes, this URL is equal to location. And if we do .search, then the query string is what gets returned. So x, variable x, is equal to this query string. Alright? And what the query string usually contains are the parameters. Or at least it did back in the day with MySpace. And so that's the first thing Samy did, was just to get the query parameters from the URL to be able to use to make post and get requests. The query string, or the URL, and the query parameters usually contain valuable user information, user cookies, ID numbers, and things of that sort. And yeah, so that's what this function is dedicated to. Alright, moving on. After that function is executed, then we get the token from that string, and we also get the friend ID from that string, or from those query parameters. We get the friend ID and the token. Alright, after that's finished, if the current URL is equal to profile.myspace.com, then we have to switch it to just being www.myspace.com, and then the path name and the search location.search, the query string. And the reason why is we have to make this distinction, or this change, is in MySpace and back in the day, only posts and get requests were made to this URL and not this URL. So if Samy tried to execute this script using this host name, it just would not be successful because it's not the appropriate URL to make post and get requests. Alright, so we have to change the URL if it's equal to profile.myspace.com. And if it's not, equal to that, then what we do is we call these two functions. Alright, first it calls g, not very descriptive for reasons mentioned earlier. And what this function g does is it focuses on getting the inner HTML of the web page. And there are two different ways to do that. We can either use create text range and then do .html text to get the inner HTML code, or we can just use this function right here, document.body.inner HTML. And as you can see, you're probably wondering why is it split up in this way? Why are we concatenating it and using the eval function? And the reason is because the term inner HTML was banned by MySpace. And so what Samy had to do is he had to concatenate the word so it wouldn't be sanitized, and it would go through the tests and pass. And that's why this function eval is what allows you to concatenate two strings in JavaScript. Alright, so that's what this function g does. It just gets the inner HTML code of the web page. Alright, so once we get that, it calls get data, and then get data calls get from URL. As you can see, it says it's passing my token and friend ID. We can probably assume what we want to get, and what we do want to get is the friend ID from the URL. So like mentioned earlier, B is equal to one double quote, so one of these. I don't know what just happened. That's what it was. Okay, my bad. Alright. So B is equal to a double quote. And if BG is equal to my token, then we set T equal to a single double quote. And then we append the equals variable. So it would be my token equals, as stated right here. That's what you would equal. And then if we just go all the way down to y, what y ends up equaling is the value of my token. Alright, with a missing double quote value at the end. So y ends up equaling the token, and that's what it gets returned. It's either the token or the other, or the friend ID. So that's what get from URL does. Alright. So once get data is called, and yes, and then M and L are global variables, just so you remember. They're declared up here. They will always be equal to my token and friend ID. Alright, and after that happens, we call main. And main is the function that executes the rest of the script. Alright. So first we call get client FID, and I think that just means getting the ID of the client. And so once we call that, then it calls find in, and remember what G does. All G does is get the inner HTML code of the web page. So find n is called with that parameter, and also this string. This is very confusing, but this first part is a string with a concatenated, and a is equal to a single quote. So it's single quote with a single quote and then another single quote, making it a double quote, I believe. And then another single quote is sent as a parameter. So there's 3 parameters in this statement. And up launch IC is probably something in particular that MySpace had that Samy needed to access. Alright, so find in. Let's look at the description of find in. So the purpose of this function is to parse and trim the response string to only contain the profile heroes data. Alright. So that's what find n does. It just gets all of the hero information that was inputted by the user. Okay. Which is just a string. Alright, so that's what client FID does. It gets the hero data. Alright, so once that's finished, we just set BH equal to this URL. With that AN value. Wait a second. Alright, I was wrong. That's what, okay, so the get home functions is the one that gets the profile hero data, and it also calls find n. But find n, when find n gets called in the main function, or when find n gets called by client FID, what it does is it gets the friend ID. It gets the friend ID of the web page the user is looking at. Okay, so that's what AN equals. It's the friend ID. And then it's used in here. And then my token is L is a global variable that is equal to the token. Alright. And then we set J, which is another global variable, equal to an XML object. So if we look at this function, look at the description, we can see that the purpose of this function is to make an XML object. We can do that one of two ways. We can use window.xml HTTP request, and if that fails, then it just returns a false Z, and then the script fails. But if this doesn't exist, then we go into this else statement, and then the active object is used. So back in the day, active object was used more, and then XML HTTP request is the more modern one. So this is the old version, this is the modern one. And some browsers back in the day used this more than this, and that's why Samy had both. But nowadays, XML HTTP request is used by almost pretty much every browser out there. And so, yeah, so the purpose of this function is purely just to create the XML object. Alright, so if we go back to main, that's what J equals. J is an XML object. And then now we can get to modifying user information. Alright. So HTTP send function is dedicated to sending either a get or post request to alter the hero information so that we can append, but Samy is my favorite hero, or whatever it was. So that's what HTTP send does. And then, but before this function gets called, this function get home gets called. Alright, so if we look at get home, so as we mentioned earlier, J is a global variable and it's equal to an XML object, and an XML object contains the ready state function or global variable, and if that ready state variable is equal to 4, then we can continue, but if it's not, then we return. And 4 is just equal, it just means that the request is finished and the response is ready. And so that's why this conditional exists, to make sure that the request and response is ready. Alright. And then response text just returns the response data as a string. So that's what AU equals. And then AG calls findN, and as discussed earlier, findN is dedicated to finding the profile heroes data. So if in the heroes section the user writes my heroes are Lindsay Lohan, Albert Einstein, and Kendrick Lamar, that's what AG will be equal to, is those names. Alright, and then that's what AG will be equal to, plus some other information, some HTML code to go along with it. And what this AG.substring does, it just removes the unnecessary information. It just gets the user input strictly. Alright. And then we make sure that that user input or user data does not already contain Samy. Because if it does, then we just don't have to do this because that user has already been infected. Alright, so if Samy does not exist in the user data string, then continue. And if AF exists, and AF is a global variable, which is equal to the string, but most of all, Samy is my hero, with div and then ID. With div, okay. And then ID, you know what ID is equal set to? It's set to AE. And AE is equal to the entire script. So this is where the warm gets pasted, is in this div ID in the hero section. So this is what, this line of code right here is what propagates the warm. Okay? Very important line of code right here. Alright, so if AF is set, then we append that, but most of all, Samy is my hero data plus the script attack. We append AF, all that, to the user information. So this is the user information. This is, but most of all, Samy is my hero plus the script, and AG is now is updated to that. Okay. And then we just get the token again from the URL. That's what AR is equal to. Then we just set a new array. We set the interest label to hero, submit equal to preview, and then the interest equal to AG. And AG, remember, is the altered heroes list with the script. And then we set J equal to a new XML object. Alright, and then we call HTTP send with the token provided up here. And then we make sure to make it a post request. And then AS is just the array. And we set it equal to a string by calling this function, which is here. It's declared here. Just letting you know that it's not a JavaScript function and it was created by Samy. Alright. So we call HTTP send with all the information. Now let's look at HTTP send. Alright. So BH is equal to the URL. Alright, BH is equal to the URL. BI is just a function call. And then BJ is either a post or get request, and then BK is the data or null. In this case, it's data. But let's go back to that function real quick, because it did call a different function. Alright. So get home does indeed call post hero. So we need to look at post hero before we can look at HTTP send. So what post hero does is it just sends a post request to HTTP send. You see the trend? Each function we've looked at recently calls HTTP send with a post request. But where they differ is the function that they call. So this nothing function is literally nothing. Alright. If we look at that function, it's nothing. Okay. So that means that concludes this. That just verifies that post hero is the last one, the last function in this cycle of HTTP send calls, these back-to-back calls. And the parameter string is equal to this array, and it's very similar. This array is very similar to the array in getHome. The only differences is the submit is different. AG is still the same, and then because remember AG is a global variable, and so all is the same except for the submit, and then we also need to get a hash value from get hidden parameters. And the purpose of this get hidden parameters is to get the hash value that exists within the URL. And what is necessary to make the post request with the hero data altered is that first we need to make a pre-get, because when you alter something on MySpace, it asks you, as soon as you hit submit, it asks you, are you okay with these changes? Or are you okay with sending a friend request? Okay. And then you click either yes or no. So in order to make sure that the post request goes through is that we need to already get the hash value that is produced from hitting OK and yes, it is okay to move forward. We need to get that hash value, and that's only possible by issuing a pre-get. And that is why post hero needs that hash value, so that the post request is successfully sent. And all we do is attach that hash value to this parameter string, and then we send it along as a post request. And then finally, we can look at HTTP send. Alright, so as stated earlier, BH is equal to the URL, BI is the function call, BJ is equal to either post or get, and then BK is either equal to null when it's a get request or equal to the parameter string array, or the array that we turned into a string that contains all the parameter values. That's what BK equals when it's a post request. Alright, so we need to make sure that J is not null, and then obvious on ready state change is another term that was banned by MySpace, so we need to Samy needed to do it in this manner so that it could go through and pass the tests and the checks by using the eval function to concatenate two strings. Also, BI, remember, is the function call. So on ready state change is equal to the function call that returns another HTTP send. So BI is essentially either another post request that was sent or a get request that was previously sent. And that's what's necessary to make the state change, are those requests. And then once that executes successfully, then we need to open the URL. So if we look at open, so in order to send an HTTP request in JavaScript, first you have to create the XML object, and then you have to open the URL. And so that's what we're doing here. We're just opening the URL. BJ is equal to either post or get. So it's either a post or get request, and then BH is the URL. And then if we set this to true, that just means that we want it done asynchronously. So that's what this true parameter does. Alright. Moving on. So if BJ is a post request, then we set the request header with its proper information. We need to encode the URL and then set the content length. Then once that's done, we send BK, and BK is the data, either null or the data. Null if it's a GET request, data if it's a POST request, and send takes care of that for us. It is a function from an XML object. And then once that POST or GET request is sent, then we just return true. And yes. So let's go back to main, because that's where this all started. So now we can look at this call again with better eyes. So we call get home first, which adds Samy is my hero to it appends, but most of all Samy is my hero, and the script to the original data, hero data. And then that's the purpose of get home, is to do all that, to alter the hero information with the script. And then once that's done, it also calls post hero. Once post hero is called, what this does, it gets the hash value, the pre-get, to make sure that the post request is successful. Alright, and remember, it just returns a nothing function. Alright, so this is the last step in this asynchronous HTTP send post requests. Get and post requests, okay? Alright, so let's go back to main. So that is what this does. First, it issues a get request, then a post request to alter the hero data, and then it makes another post request to get the hash value so that the post request is successful. And it does all these requests asynchronously, and it does it without the user realizing it, because that's what XML objects do, is that they execute behind the scenes without altering anything. Like it says it right here, it says, okay, the XML object can be used to exchange data with the server behind the scenes. This means that it is possible to update parts of a web page without reloading the whole page, which essentially means that we can alter the web page without the user even realizing what just happened, because it doesn't need to re-render or reload the web page in order to alter it. So yes, this HTTP send does everything asynchronously, and it updates the hero information with the script so that it can propagate. Alright, so once that HTTP send is complete, then we create a new XML object. And this is a global variable also. And then we call HTTP send 2, which is essentially, it does the same thing as HTTP send. It's a different process. And HTTP get some water real quick. HTTP send 2 is dedicated to making sending the friend request to Samy. So this is the first one alters the hero information with the script. This one sends the friend request to Samy. Okay. So as you can see, it says invite.addFriend. See, the URL verifies what I'm saying. And the friend ID and the ID of Samy back in the day was this number right here. So this is Samy's ID number. And he just hard-coded it. Alright, and then equal to my token, which is the token of the user. And then it calls process X form. Alright, and look at that, it is a GET request. So first it makes a GET request. But let's look at process X form. Alright. So we've already established what for equals. For means that the response is ready to be sent. This, remember, is the XML object declared up here. This kind of just gets the response data, so that's what AU is equal to. And then we just pass AU to get the hidden parameters called hash code. So that's what AQ is equal to the hash code from that response data. And then AR is equal to the token, the user token, the current user token, the client token. And then we just create a new AS array, set the appropriate values, friend ID, this is Samy's ID, and then we submit add to friends. Alright, and then we call HTTP send 2 with a nothing function. So this is the final step in the friend request process. Alright, and it does issue it as a post request. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. It calls HTTP send 2, so let's look at that, which is right here. Again, this is the XML object. We gotta make sure it's not null. Gotta do this because MySpace bans on ready state change. We also equal it to BI, which is the function call, which is it's either nothing or process X information. Oh, I see. Okay, so on ready state change is either equal to true or false. Okay. So this is just a boolean. If it's true, then it'll execute. If it's false, it will not. Alright. So then we just open the XML object or the URL for this particular XML object, and then we set BJ. BJ is equal to either post or get, and then BH is the URL provided. And then true means it is necessary that it be done asynchronously with all the other HTTP requests, post and get requests. They all need to be done asynchronously. And then if it is a post request, then we set the proper request headers. and we encode the URL and we set the length, and then we send the data. And remember, if it's a GET request, that variable is just equal to null. But if it's a POST request, then it's equal to the parameter string, which is set up here. And that's what makes the request. That's what alters the data, or that's what sends the friend request, this function. And so we send it and then return true, and the entire process is done asynchronously, and then the entire script has been executed and the worm has been propagated to a new user, and all these functions have been executed successfully. Alright, so once again, this first HTTP send function alters the hero's data. It appends, but most of all, Samy is my hero, and this entire script is appended to the original hero's data provided by the user. That's what this function does. And then this second HTTP send function adds Samy as a friend. And it's all done behind the scenes without the user realizing it, because XML objects can execute or update the page without having to re-render or reload the web page, making the user clueless to what's going on until they go back and see that their hero list has been altered. Okay, so that's the entire explanation of this cross-scripting attack / worm created by Samy, a 19-year-old young man who did suffer some consequences for his actions. But all in all, he does seem to be a computer wizard to have been able to figure this out back in 2005 without on his own, basically. But he did serve 3 years of probation, and after those 3 years, he has not been back to jail, and his focus has been elsewhere. But it's still, well, by elsewhere I mean to the good and betterment of society. But I believe he is still involved in the computer science field, and he does do coding projects of that sort. I assume he probably does some security, but who knows? He is a success story in America, after all. But yes, I hope you enjoyed that explanation of the attack. And yes, Samy, studying this attack has taught me a lot about cross-scripting vulnerabilities and how easy it really is to expose a website, and how dangerous it is to not properly write or program the code to avoid these type of attacks. So this research project has really taught me a lot, and I hope you enjoyed that explanation, Professor Ray and GTA Sacchini. I hope it wasn't too long, and I hope you learned something from this too. All right. I hope you guys have a good rest of your day, and goodbye.